I'm Rachel Tanucci from the Bloomfield Public Library, and we are here tonight with Sue Carey, author of More Than Merely Eyes Can See, which is a newly published book that's just come out. And we'll tell you all about that in a moment, but I'm going to introduce Sue to you. Sue relocated to Hartford, Connecticut, eager to embrace city living in a vibrant multicultural community. She explored its neighborhoods on foot, absorbing their history, cuisine, and music. But it was at her church's weekly community supper where she came to know her neighbors. So you're going to be getting a little bit of a glimpse into that this evening, where she shares with us a little bit about living in Hartford and the sort of experiment that kind of came to be through these Friday dinners and building community. So while we're going through this tonight, we'll kind of ask you all to think a little bit about building community and what that might mean. So Sue, I'm going to turn it over to you.
And thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you to the Bloomfield Public Library. A year or so after the murder of George Floyd, like so many people, I was anxious to be able to do something and educate myself about social justice and racial justice. And somehow, well, through a mutual friend, found out that Bloomfield Public Library has a social justice book club. And Bloomfield is one town north of Hartford where I live. And thanks to Rachel and the library, they welcomed me as a participant in the monthly book discussions. So I've had a great time getting to know people there, and several of them are joining us tonight. And I am especially grateful to Rachel and the library because this is the first author talk that I've been able to do on Zoom. And because of that, there are so many people here from across the United States. And I wanted to invite everybody who's here tonight just to use the chat for your own interest and maybe just put in where you're from. People from South Carolina and Florida, Maryland, New Jersey, North Carolina. And I know that there are people in Pennsylvania and Minnesota that have been reading the book as well, and maybe they'll be joining us. So there are people here and people from afar that are part of this. And again, thank you for the Zoom platform that lets us all be together tonight. I also want to thank and draw your attention. One of the participants here tonight is my publisher, named Dr. Melissa Sue John. She is local here, and without Melissa, there wouldn't be a book. I'm grateful to Melissa reading the book and grasping what it was I was trying to say and making it possible that in 2024, this book got published. So the format tonight is that I want to read two chapters to you, or a portion of chapters, to introduce the book and then give you an idea of the flavor of what it's about. This talk is geared towards folks who have not yet read the book, but opening it up for discussion. And I want to just ground us for a second. This book takes place, the stories here take place in Hartford, Connecticut. And I thought that you might also write into the chat, have you been in Hartford yourself? And to think about these questions, have you lived in Hartford? Do you live here now? Did you used to live here? Do you commute into Hartford to go to work or attend a baseball game or a concert or the theater or the art museum? From people who've read the book, many have told me, yes, they understand this is Hartford stories, but it's about people, and the experiences of people are somewhat universal. So first, to think about what your experience may have been. Many of my friends that are here tonight, even though they are living out of state, they had connections to Hartford, and I just want to bring some of that back to you. And so I'm going to begin with reading to you the introduction to the book. It sets the stage for how all of this came to be and then what the rest of the book is about. And again, I just invite you to use the chat as questions or comments come up as I'm reading. Feel free to use that. And then with Rachel's help, we'll revisit that. So let me begin. Most Fridays since 2013, Harry, a 65-year-old white man, walks from his apartment to the Friday gathering. It's about 3/4 of a mile to where Grace Lutheran Church serves a free weekly supper. Harry lives in Hartford, Connecticut, a mid-sized city, and his apartment is located on a large, beautifully landscaped campus that serves adults with disabilities and seniors. The complex is gated and set back from the busy street that serves as a major artery to the nearby interstate highway, whose entrance and exit ramps border one side of Harry's complex. The street is lined with a mix of 19th century Queen Anne-style homes and mid-20th century three-story brick apartment buildings, symbolic of the changes this section of the city has experienced over the last century. A few of the houses are run down and need new roofs and paint. Some operate small bodegas on the ground floor, and Harry worries because a few of them are boarded up. Mature trees towering over the roofs line the street and are evidence, too, of the age of the neighborhood. In the summertime, the leafy canopy shades the sidewalk. It offers relief from the heat for pedestrians and residents escaping their hot apartments. As Harry heads to Grace, he passes people who linger along the way. They don't acknowledge him, and he keeps his head down. At the corner, Harry knows a couple who live by the Subway sandwich shop. If he notices them, he says hello and continues on his way. Most people, though, keep to themselves. They are city people, dressed for the weather and for being on foot. Many are Black or Latino, a reflection of the city's demographics. Harry turns the corner onto Farmington Avenue, a busy east-west corridor that connects Hartford with the suburbs. At this corner, both sides of the street are filled with fast food and small restaurants, a gas station, and strip malls. In 2016, a streetscape improvement project added decorative lighting, new brick sidewalks, traffic islands, and landscaping. Bus stops are located here, and they draw tenants from the apartment buildings that are tucked away on adjacent side streets. The small businesses on Farmington Avenue give way to a row of three-story brick buildings. A few blocks later, Harry passes a sprawling lawn that was once Mark Twain's home, now converted into a museum. On Tuesdays in the summertime, a farmer's market sets up in the nearby parking lot that's reserved for museum tourists. At this hour of the afternoon, when Harry walks to Grace, suburban commuters, employees of the nearby insurance companies and medical center, they fill the streets, their cars jockeying for position with city buses as they head for the highway and out of Hartford. During the week, their morning influx and afternoon exodus ebb and flow like the tide. City people fill the sidewalks and buses, while suburban commuters, safe inside their automobiles, fill the streets. Although they are in close proximity to each other, the gulf that separates city and suburban residents is vast. City people are mostly Black and brown, while suburbanites are predominantly white. Hartford is one of the poorest cities in the state, whereas the surrounding communities are well off. The absence of meaningful relationships between these neighbors allows negative stereotypes to persist about people of color and people who are poor. Many city people absorb these characterizations of themselves too. The separation and isolation between them fuel mistrust and disrupt the capacity to form healthy social bonds. Meaningful social connections are essential to our survival and the ability to thrive. They are the remedy for loneliness, which has been called an epidemic that reaches across all levels of society. John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago studied the impact that loneliness takes on health and well-being, writing that it interferes with our ability to cope with even normal frustrations of day-to-day living. His research showed that loneliness not only alters behavior, but shows up in measurements of stress hormones, immune function, and cardiovascular function that may be hastening millions of people to an early grave. Expanding on these findings, Vivek Murthy, MD, and the 19th US Surgeon General said that loneliness magnifies the pain of dealing with addiction, violence, anxiety, and depression. Murthy focused on the benefit of social connections, writing, while loneliness has the potential to kill, connection has even more potential to heal. It's in our relationships that we find the emotional sustenance and power we need in order to thrive. When I interviewed Harry and asked him why he returned every week to the Friday gathering, he said he comes because Pastor Eva invited him, even though she's been gone from Grace for many years. And I'll just let you know, I think she's on the call tonight. The power of that first invitation hasn't faded. Harry said that at the Friday gathering, he doesn't feel as lonely as before he arrived. The Friday gathering is where people say his name when they greet him. They acknowledge his contributions, and they understand his desire to matter to the friends he's made there. Harry said that he often feels invisible and lost, even though he's lived in Hartford and in the same apartment complex for decades. The isolation is so intense that Harry blurted out to me, "When people say hi to me, I know I'm alive." Recognizing our own need for meaningful connections makes it possible for us to imagine others' need for it. Dr. Murthy stated, "We all have a deep and abiding need to be seen for who we are, as fully dimensional, complex, and vulnerable human beings. We all need to know that we matter and that we are loved." In 2010, the congregation of Grace Lutheran Church was facing some of the same obstacles as Harry. Although it is located in the heart of the city, Grace was isolated from the neighborhood. Most members lived in the suburbs and commuted into Hartford for worship services. Their relationships with neighbors had dissolved a decade earlier. Neighbors who cut through the church parking lot and members of the congregation were strangers to each other. The congregation's isolation had allowed an incomplete image to form of the people they saw on the street. The members of Grace found themselves struggling to be relevant and asked, "Why has God put us in this place? If Grace ceased to exist, would anyone care or notice?" The congregation confronted the gap between the commandment to love thy neighbor and how they practiced it. They resolved to rebuild relationships and integrate back into the neighborhood. They started with hosting the Friday gathering, a free community supper. To the casual observer, excuse me, the Friday gathering may look like a soup kitchen, but from the beginning, the gathering was about building community. And at the heart of community is relationships. Many organizations, not just churches, want to be perceived as warm and welcoming. But the hospitality we are used to practicing is rooted in our culture with prescribed roles for the host and guest. It creates a hierarchical structure that can be a barrier to building deep, enriching relationships. When I moved to Hartford, I was ready to embrace city living. My suburban friends urged me to be careful, to not walk alone, and to carry protection. They were projecting what they thought they knew about the people who live in Hartford. I was eager to experience different cultures and make new friends, and instead I grounded my perceptions in what I experienced firsthand. I joined Grace and was part of the committee that formed the Friday gathering. For 13 years, between 75 and 100 of us have gathered around the dinner table every week to share life. We became the keepers of each other's stories. More than 40 neighbors agreed to share their stories in this book, and trusted me to tell them that we might know each other more fully. The people I met, many who are poor or people of color, are funny, hardworking, intelligent, and loving. Their stories push back at the stereotypes and stigma that sensationalize the headlines and keep us from widening our circle of relationships. Census data and crime statistics frame a single story about the people who live here, which includes me. We need more stories, more than data, to know our neighbor. Even the wealthiest communities have poor and disenfranchised members. And if we only pay attention to the stereotypes, we all suffer. It is in affirming our differences and honoring our humanity that we become whole. This is how even the wealthiest, most educated, and most socially connected of us find belonging in relationships where we can be our whole selves. Belonging is the antidote to loneliness, and our souls long for it. And I'll at least invite you back for a moment, Rachel. That's the end of the introduction, but it sets the stage for the 40-some people who did share their stories with me. We had a few pictures since this was Zoom and a different format for doing this kind of talk. Yep. Rachel asked if maybe I might just share a few photos. So I wanted to give you an idea of what Grace looks like. I call it a modest church. It was built around the year 1950. It sort of looks like a typical New England church, except it's made of brick instead of clapboard. But many of the churches in Hartford are older and ornate, and this is, to me, a moderate type of church. And let's see, next. The next photo that I have to share is a picture of our dining hall. That's probably a 1950s floor. Somebody out there is chuckling, I hope. But it gives you an idea, again, of our modest setting where we can see 100 diners with tables closer together than this. And I'll draw your attention to the photos on the walls. A lot of the inspiration for sharing stories originated with these 8x10 portraits. More than 400 of them fill the walls of the dining hall and represent the people who come to dinner. And let's see, the next slide gives you a different idea. Here we are. For many years, things have adjusted somewhat since the pandemic, when we had to close for more than 2 years from sit-down dining. We didn't change other things, but we couldn't sit down together. And since we've reopened, it is hard to go back to where you were. But there was a time where almost every single week featured live musicians coming, and I write in one chapter in the book about how music brought the group together. It turned a meal into an event where people wanted to stay and linger. And that was part of our building community. And then I think the last slide is just more of these 8x10 photographs. There are now more than 600 of these. Not everybody agrees to have their picture taken, but the people that do, this gives you an example of them. And unless you want to interrupt or interject, Rachel, I'll just go on and read the next story. We'll keep these pictures up on the screen and you can imagine a little bit about these people. I'm going to read you. So again, as I said before, there's about 40 to 45 people who shared stories. And I'm going to read you tonight the story of Lewis. Lewis's picture is not in this group, so I don't want you to try to look too hard to figure it out. He's not here. He is part of a chapter that is called Changing What We Cannot Accept. And the introduction to the chapter is this. Some diners come to the Friday gathering because this is where they choose to give back. Giving back expresses their desire for a more kind and just society. They're mindful of the advantages that have favored them, while also aware that others suffer from a lack of those privileges. In this chapter, the story of chefs Gladys and Lewis begin with how they came to learn about the Friday gathering, the networks of relationships, and the invitation to stand with our community. And beneath their stories of giving back are stories of protest against the inequitable systems that shackle all of us. Like Gladys, Lewis learned about the Friday gathering because his church, First Calvary Baptist, had a relationship with Grace. Calvary Baptists worshiped at Grace on Sundays following Grace's services. Afterward, First Calvary served a hot meal and invited the neighbors to join them. It was first Pastor Eva and then Pastor Rick who got to know Lewis and his wife Carmen through Lewis's cooking. Lewis said, Pastor Rick made a habit before heading home on Sundays of stopping in the kitchen and taste testing. About 4 years ago, and it's much more than 4 years ago, probably 6 or 7 now, because this book has been in the process of being written for a few years. So when Lewis talked, he said, about 4 years ago, when Pastor Rick asked if I'd be interested in cooking for the Friday gathering, I said yes. Yes, Pastor Rick agreed. I was involved in drafting Lewis as a chef. In fact, I bugged him about it until he said yes. At least that's my recollection. I love his cooking and I enjoy his company. On Fridays, when he's the chef, he always brings a sample up to my office before dinner is served so that I can have a taste and know what's on the menu. It's very special and I love it. Lewis was born in 1954 in Kentucky. On his mother's side, he is descended from the Cherokee and the Dutch. On his father's side, he's a mix of Blackfoot and African American. He never knew his birth father, and the man never claimed him. Lewis's mother married a coal miner from West Virginia, and 2 years later, his half-sister, or 2 years younger than Lewis, his half-sister was born. Lewis's stepfather was the only father he ever knew, and Lewis called him Dad. When Lewis was about 7 years old, the family moved to Hartford. The owner of the mine where his father worked lived in Connecticut, and Lewis supposed that his father linked his future with the owner's and came north. Dad was a ladies' man, Lewis said, and the owner of the mine was a woman. He followed her north. For my mother, coming north meant that she could get away from her family. They made things difficult for her after I was born. I never felt like I was welcomed by that side of the family. Like Gladys, Lewis lived in Hartford in the early 1960s. A series of public projects were well underway, and they would transform the city. The elevated Interstate 91 was completed as a north-south corridor along the city's eastern edge, parallel to the Connecticut River. Interstate 84, an east-west route, was built and bisected Hartford, dividing it economically and ethnically. Neighborhoods were demolished to make room for highway entrance and exit ramps, and government-subsidized housing projects were constructed. Andrew Walsh, an associate director of the Greenberg Center at Trinity College in Hartford, said, the North End became a public housing corridor with a concentration of very low-income residents, increasingly cut off from access to jobs or local retail. This is where Lewis and other diners, including Albert, Lorraine, Papa Charles, Carmelita, and Edith, grew up. We lived on Avon Street, Lewis said, about 2 miles south of a tree-lined neighborhood of single-family homes where Gladys's family had lived. But my neighborhood doesn't exist anymore. You won't find it on a map, Lewis said. The city took it to build the Sand Housing Project, and we moved a few blocks away. I grew up in the Bellevue Square Housing Project. In elementary and middle school, Lewis had a hard time fitting in. I was chased a lot by the other kids, he said. And then he laughed. I was probably the instigator as much as they were. Compared to some classmates, Lewis was light skinned and his friends were light skinned too. He said, in middle school one day, a few kids started talking in Spanish to me. They found out I wasn't Spanish when I couldn't answer them. Because of my skin color, they thought I was Hispanic. People, Black people too, look at skin color and make assumptions about where you fit in. To some people in my family, because of my mother's Dutch ancestry, I'm the white boy. I don't like to say I'm Black. I'm African American or Black American. I can't ever just be American. If I say I'm African American, then I lose the Native American part of me. If I say I'm Native American, then I lose the Dutch and the African American part of me. When I was young, it hurt. It hurt for a long time. I didn't know where I belonged. Putting labels on people messes everything up. In the 1960s, Hartford's prosperity was becoming more divided. There was a sense that overwhelming problems were building up. The riots, culminating in 1969, expressed African American rage at racial isolation, housing and job segregation, overcrowding in the slum neighborhoods, and troubled relations with police and city government. Their chief immediate impact, though, was to accelerate white flight from the city and to damage the neighborhoods where the rioters lived. I was out in the streets protesting the conditions along with everyone else, Lewis said, referring to the unrest and the demonstrations in Hartford in the 1960s. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, there were riots. We tried to march to City Hall, but they blocked the roads and locked us in. Where is it that we could go to protest? He asked. This is still a major concern in my life. Businesses were destroyed, furniture, clothing, and grocery stores and pharmacies. The businesses didn't belong to the people who lived there. They were making money off of us. Those businesses never came back, and you can still see the scars today. At one point, I was adopted by the Black Panthers. I was being chased by a bunch of Spanish kids, and we were running down the street past where the Panthers had an office. They saw us coming, and they stepped in between me and the group of kids behind me. I think they intervened because it wasn't fair, one kid up against a bunch of other kids. The Black Panthers protected me and kept me from getting beat up. In 10th grade, the school told me they were going to hold me back a year. I couldn't take the idea of 3 more years of school, and I already had a child on the way. I quit school when I was 17. I worked at a car wash for a few years. Eventually, I enrolled in a program at the community renewal team and started cooking. How did I turn out? Lewis asked, and then he answered his own question. I'm not rich, not poor. I love life, but I've also got fear. My mother was a caregiver for a white woman who lived in Avon, an affluent suburb of Hartford. She did it a few days a week for a couple of years, and I drove her back and forth. I can't count the number of times I was stopped by the police. The cops knew who I was, and they stopped me anyway. It happened often enough that I was ready for it, prepared for it, and still afraid of it. And it's happened in New Britain too. I got pulled over by 2 white cops. My daughter ran out of gas one night in New Britain. She had just gotten off the highway and it was a dark stretch of road. She called me and I got over there as fast as I could. You don't want to get stopped in a place that isn't well lit. I don't want to go camping or hiking. I don't want to go skiing. I don't want to be by myself where there are no witnesses. This fear is real. When I was growing up and we went back to Kentucky or West Virginia to visit family, we could all be sitting around having a good time. And then a white person shows up at the door. Everyone stopped talking. You had to stand at attention. You might not know what they wanted, but you had to give them all the respect. Those memories affect my fear today. About 10 years ago, my wife Carmen and I bought a house in the suburbs, 5 bedrooms, enough for our kids and grandchildren to visit. We found out we weren't welcomed in the neighborhood. They were afraid of what we were going to do to them. The lady across the street peeked out the window anytime we went out. The next door neighbor complained that we drove on their yard. They came to our door and yelled at us. They complained when we had family over and said we made too much noise. When they had parties, they made noise and they threw their beer bottles over the fence onto our property. I told my kids not to throw them back. We bagged the bottles up and left the bag on their side of the fence. There was no peace, Lewis said. The message I hear is that it's my culture that has to change. I refuse to give any more than I've already given. Lewis relaxed when he started to talk about his children. I love my kids. I wouldn't trade them for anything in the world. I do wish, though, that I waited until I was ready so that I could have given them everything they deserve. Lewis has 10 children, including Carmen's 4. 2 of Carmen's daughters waitressed at a Ruby Tuesdays restaurant where Lewis was the chef. They liked Lewis and they pestered him until he took their mother on a date. As they say, Lewis laughed, the rest is history. Carmen is his 3rd wife, and they've been together for more than 12 years. Lewis said, her girls are like daughters to me. My first wife left me. She left the kids too. The kids blamed me for her leaving. She got hooked on drugs and I was unfaithful, and I was using drugs then too. But I decided not to leave my kids. I chose to stay. I regret their anger, though. They were angry at me for working all the time to support us. They were angry because I wasn't home more. They were angry at my unsavory alliances and angry at my womanizing. My kids witnessed a lot of things, and for them to turn out okay makes me proud. They are the most loving and caring kids. We talk on the phone or see each other every day. My sons have followed me into the profession of cooking. My son Keith won't make a decision without checking with me first. He calls me up and says, "What do you think of this, Dad?" I had one of those aha moments when my mother died, Lewis said. It's been 15 years. She had a DNR, a do not resuscitate order, and I didn't know what that was. I couldn't bear it when she died, and I insisted that the doctor bring her back. I carried on so much that she opened her eyes and told me to let her go. I saw that Mama was happy where she had gone. Why did I have to do that to her? Lewis asked. It made me realize that Jesus has been with me my entire life, saving me. Even when I didn't know it or ask for it, he's been saving me. Why do I come to the Friday gathering? Lewis said. Because I want more out of church. Where is the church in all that's going on today? I want more than going to service on Sundays and paying my tithe. I want to be on the street where people are having the hardest time. I want to be a part of something, but the churches don't want to work together. They want to hold on to their authority. Everybody is blaming someone else for their troubles, Lewis continued. They blame the police or the government. They blame the teachers and the parents. They blame the kids, but nobody is blaming themselves for what's not working today. The church has a responsibility to care for its community. There was a time when the church and the community were the same thing. You can't just tell them you love them. You have to live it with them. When they're in pain, you have to share that too. I want to give witness to the saving grace of Jesus. Every Monday night, you can find me in the north end of Hartford, on the street, standing with the people and sharing life. That's Lewis's story.
Thank you, Sue. So we have many of these stories in the book, and we have these photos here in front of us. So let's talk a little bit about the process that you went through, and then maybe the title of the book as well, and why you chose to call it More Than Merely Eyes Can See.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a little bit about how that came to be, and maybe a little bit of the process of conducting the interviews as well?
Sure. So I mentioned before and showed you pictures of the dining hall with all the pictures displayed on the wall. And there was a Friday night. We were all sitting around having dinner, and a woman showed up, and she was just frantic. And she explained to us that she had lost contact with her brother. And she didn't say it, but she implied she was worried. She wanted to know, was he alive or dead? Had somebody seen him? And she'd heard about our wall of pictures. And she came and said, can I look at all the pictures? If I could find my brother on the wall here, I would know he'd been here. It would be a sign that he was still alive. Well, we were not able that night to find his picture. And she told us his name, and we couldn't connect his name. And after the woman left, it really was unsettling. And a group of us moved around the room, pointing to one picture after another, naming the people we could. But it sort of shocked us, the names of the people we were already forgetting. It had been 3 or 4 months since somebody had been here, and already we were forgetting names. And I think that night was one of the first times that it was uttered, we need stories to go with these pictures. And so it fell to a few of us, but mostly to me, out of the conversations I had had with people, I began rather methodically trying to collect short stories that told something about people. In fact, and that leads into your question, Rachel, about the interview process. In the beginning, when it was announced, oh, we're looking for people to tell stories about themselves, many people resisted. They said, it's nobody's business. I'm not talking to you. What's it to you? What are you going to do with this information? It was the first inkling I had as to how fragile the level of trust was, even though we've been doing this every Friday for years, showing up. That was the first hint of how fragile trust is and how much it takes to earn trust. Anyways, a few people volunteered. They were happy to tell their story. And I announced to people, I began with 4 questions and announced them to the room ahead of time so there wouldn't be any mystery about what I was doing. And I asked folks, how did you get to Hartford? Which allowed them to say, I was born here, moved here, whatever. And share a memory from your childhood, because we've all been children, and I thought we could connect on that. And then I asked them if they had a message for the community. And those were the 3 questions that always began everything, but the storytellers were in charge of their stories. The process then was, I took notes, no recordings, but I took notes, crafted a story, brought it back, read it to the person, and we went back and forth until they were satisfied. Only one time did a person, I think they really recoiled from hearing the history of their life and said, rip it up, and never engaged in the process again. But everybody else stuck with it one way or the other. And some people elaborated a lot to tell their stories. And then one night I asked for permission to read one of the stories aloud, and that really began to change things. The diners celebrated and clapped for each other as they listened to what people shared about themselves. And we began to learn so much about each other that then it was Pastor Rick who said, you need to turn this into a book. And just to wrap that part up really quickly and turn it back to you, Rachel, what happened just about that time is the pandemic shut down the ability to meet in person. And the good thing was spring was right around the corner. And so I started to ask people, meet me in the park, meet me at the gazebo. And now, since it was just 2 of us by ourselves with nobody to overhear, what had once been a 45-minute or an hour conversation turned into hours upon hours upon hours, lots and lots of conversations that led to these very, very rich stories.
So let's talk a little bit about the title. Why did you title the book More Than Merely Eyes Can See?
So the book did go through a bunch of titles, but one day I was interviewing Bernie Michael, who is the photographer, and I wanted his story to be in the book. And so at one point I asked Bernie, um, how had taking all of these photos affected him? And partly too, because over time I got to see how he modified his process. I was, a participant observer to how he changed his process. And in answering my question, how it had affected him, Bernie said that the more he took pictures, the more he focused literally just on the face, trying to remove all of those attributes that would give you a sense of somebody's occupation or wealth, as he called it, the characteristics that make us valuable to society or the way society judges us. And he said, I began to separate the person and to see more than eyes can see, or to see more than eyes merely can see. Anyways, the title is a rearrangement of some of his words, but it expresses his ability to move beyond our worth as measured by society and to see the dignity in each other.
So you talked about trust a little bit. How did you get people to trust you to be able to tell their stories? How do you think that came from your idea of this is not a soup kitchen, this is a dinner where we all share in this dinner together? Can you talk a little bit about your model for that dinner?
So I think that those are two very different questions. How did trust happen and the model for dinner, I think, are two different things. I do think that the trust is something that I have, that's something that's shared between me and the diners, that they, I don't know. I think trusting an organization or a group like the Friday Gathering is different than trusting an individual. Early on, when I was doing a story, and I read it back to a man, one night he said to me, "Oh, you did really good." And I remember sitting there thinking, well, that's a compliment, but I really don't know what I did. That's good. And I asked him if he could tell me more. And very directly, he said, "You told my story without judging it." And I like to think that I was already that kind of a person, being able to listen that way. But hearing him put it into words really, magnified my commitment to be able to listen and to not judge, to not fill in ahead of time what I thought somebody was going to say, and to really try to see things from their point of view, and to see their dignity. And I think it was just that commitment of however long it took. And I, in many ways, complied with their wishes. Um, Only one man put a lot of conditions on the storytelling, but I think other people did it in subtle ways. And I was willing to let them be the leader in this. I was not the leader, I was not in charge. At we were in a partnership with this, and to me, I needed to suspend and give them that control. As far as the model for the dinners, very early on when the dinner started, um, I think again we were concerned about trust, and we wanted to get to know the neighborhood. And so from the very beginning, we were determined that anybody who was involved as a volunteer needed to also participate as a diner, which meant you can't stay behind the serving table. You can't let the serving table and the trays of food separate you from the folks. And we were very purposeful, especially in the very early years, of making sure that anybody who had volunteered had time to get a plate, sat down at a table, and learned how to have a conversation with people you've never met before. And that process then opened us up to lots of other lessons which I reveal one by one in the book. It would be a lot to go into now.
Thank you. Yes, there's so much that we'll talk about, and I do want to let everybody know that we're going to later toward the end of the year and into the winter be reading the book for our social justice book club. One of the titles will be Sue's book, so we will have much more to share and get to discuss it with all of you because it will be virtual, so you can join us from anywhere. And we'll be providing copies of the book. The other great thing is all of the proceeds from the purchases of the book go to Boys and Girls Clubs of Hartford. So I guess I would just ask one more thing about the takeaways for how to build this sense of community that you did so carefully here and so intentionally here. Do you have, even though you say, you know, you definitely revealed a lot through the book in terms of what you learned, do you have any advice you would give to people who might want to use this model in their own community, or maybe just other general advice that you would give from what you learned?
Yeah, I think, I think behind the word community is really belonging. And I might ask people to leave after tonight and think about the experiences that you've had when you really felt you belonged somewhere. And when you were told you belonged, but somewhere in your heart, you knew you didn't. Um, Somebody just recently shared with me, you're told that you're welcomed here, but people won't look you in the face. They won't look you in the eye. They won't acknowledge that you exist. And that's what I mean when I say people tell you you belong, but somewhere inside you know that you don't. And it could really hurt to have to acknowledge, no, I don't, even though you're telling me I do. I think one of the hardest things about building community is sharing power. I think that's been one of the personal lessons for me. And I think it's really important for anybody who wants to do social justice work and to think about bringing together different groups of people to form a community. And I think about the friends that I know that have been involved in DEIA, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, all of those types of programs that have sprung up. It's one thing to tell people we're bringing more people to the table, more voices and things like that. But at the end of the day, who makes the decisions? And you can tell who makes the decisions by where the money goes, who controls the purse strings. When you change your priority, when you allow other people to have a voice, the way you spend your funds will change as well. And I think this is the thing that we all struggle with. And even now, I am part of a new group, maybe forming next week to deal with homelessness, prepare for it this winter in Hartford. And figuring out whose voices are going to matter. Somebody can tell you, I'm homeless, this is what I need. And somebody else who's part of I'll just call it bureaucracy, the system, well, they'll say, well, this is what's available. So trying to figure out how you negotiate and share that vision. I think we get so used to, we value in our society efficiency, how fast you can get things done. And I think building community takes a long, long time. And so to think it's not just a project that exists on a checklist, building community, done, move on to the next one. I think we have to be prepared for things to take time. And it's sometimes hard to have patience when you feel like you have to produce results. So I don't know, that's probably a bit all over the place, but.
No, thank you. We have a question. Was it hard to hear some of the stories?
Oh, Lord, yes. I have a whole chapter about how the stories were written and a lot of the different questions that I wrestled with. And in the beginning, I thought that I needed to be an impartial observer, or, I would just listen. I did not want to react to anything that was said. I didn't want people to feel judged, like, oh, that's terrible, or how could you? And I thought that if I reacted, I might encourage people to embellish their stories or add more drama to it. I never had evidence that any of that happened. But everything changed for me one night. This man who for months had said, I'm not telling you my story. My story is too bad. Nobody wants to hear my story. And then one night after I read them aloud, he changed his mind, said, okay, I'll talk to you. And he talked in a very bland, monotone voice, almost to the point where I missed what he was saying. And then he told me that just before he was born, his mom was pregnant with him. Just before he was born, his 18-month-old brother, baby brother, 18 months old, stuck a fork in a toaster, electrocuted himself, and died. And then he went on and started talking about something else. And I just couldn't reconcile so many things. I've been a mother, I've had young kids. I know what it's like to not be able to watch them every second of the day. I'm afraid of electrocuting. All the warnings about dropping your hair dryer in the sink and unplug the toaster. I just couldn't reconcile. I literally had to stop and cry. And there were other stories. I won't give them all away, but there were other stories. I learned that being in relationship mattered more than writing a book. And so, especially when the most tragic of moments came, I needed to sit with them. And I think people told me stories that nobody had ever grieved with them before. So we took the time to grieve.
And as far as the process, again, this is your first book, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. How long would you say it took to conduct all the interviews and transcribe everything?
In some ways, it's always hard. When did this book begin? There's so many starting points in terms of relationship. But I made the commitment to the book literally on Christmas Eve 2019. December 24th, 2019. I was listening to the news in the morning and I couldn't believe this. They said the #1 New Year's resolution is I want to write a book. I was like, I thought it was lose weight. But anyways, they said, I want to write a book. And if that's what your New Year's resolution is, you have to commit to writing every single day. And so that was the day I became committed. And from that to putting it, in book form, 4.5 years. And I must say, because it is a lot of people who are on the call tonight, one of the best things I did, I had friends who agreed to read. As I wrote, they read, and then they asked questions, and they helped me clean up my act. That's one story. But they also told me where things were confusing or where they wanted more information. And for all the people who have told me the book is good, it's because there were so many readers and many of them are here tonight. So thank you.
Thank you.